Have all of you here. Happy holidays to you all, and a wonderful experience we have of our Tuesdays With series. I'm Bob. I think I know everybody. Hi, never mind. I'm Bob Willey anyway, or I've met you today, which is very nice. Very glad to have you here as a part of our Tuesdays With series that runs from September through May, and we sometimes have a December and sometimes not, and this month we thought, yeah, let's do it, and good friend Mac McAlister is here to speak today. We're looking forward to that very much, and a special opportunity of an area of expertise. Our Tuesdays With series is this a monthly lecture series, the third Tuesday of each month, and we have individuals, experts in various topics, and the topics relate to Georgetown, the Georgetown area, and always try to help learn a little bit more. As we've often pointed out, Tuesdays With comes from that book published in the 1990s, Tuesdays with Maury, and it's a wonderful book if you've never read it, of a wonderful relationship between a college student and a professor that continues well beyond the college years, well into his 40s, 50s, and 60s, and stays in contact with one of his professors, Maury, who's just a great inspiration and encouragement. Anyway, that's what we're all about, is continuing to learn, and something that's, I think, an important challenge for all of us, whatever our age, to continue to be learners. Today, we're pleased to have with us Mac McAlister, one of the early people I met, first people I met when I came to Georgetown. Often have told the story that Carol and I were looking for a place to retire, and saw a dot on the map. It said Georgetown, never been here. I tell people I don't play golf. We've never been to Myrtle Beach, and never been in this area at all. Got here to Georgetown and just fell in love with it right away. Went down Front Street, and two things I remember very, very well. I was just telling Lily Jean this story the other day. One was there was this incredible bookstore on Front Street. There were two stories. Actually, it was a three-story building with a house on the apartment on the third floor. First two, just beautiful. And I told Carol, I'm not going to tell you anything except there's this incredible bookstore. Tragically, a week later, that bookstore no longer existed. So you get the timing of 2013 when I visited just before the fire. But I had also visited the Maritime Museum, and I was so concerned when I heard about the bookstore being gone. I thought, oh no, that Maritime Museum is fantastic. And boy, praise God, it got saved, didn't get burned. The models, I gathered, there was a lot of action to preserve and protect what was there. And that's where Mac comes in. Mac was the founding curator of the Maritime Museum. If you've never been there, you gotta go. It's a fantastic exhibit, built on what was the excellent work that Mac did for so many years there, and great museum and a great place to visit as a part of our Georgetown community. So I'm pleased, and it's free, because of the Wooden Boat Show. Thank you very much. Just a little bit about Mac, an author, and quite a few books, all of which are extremely well written and illustrated. A sailor, retired construction manager, and the founding curator of the South Carolina Maritime Museum. Will you join me in welcoming Mac McAlister?
Thank you very much. I thank Bob and everybody at the museum for inviting me. And I really don't have many subjects that I can talk about, but sailing and the history of this area is one thing that I have really enjoyed all the time I've been here. And we lived in Georgetown for some years ago, worked at the paper company as an engineer, and later on I came back here and was associated with Belle Isle for a good while. And at one point, my wife and I, our two sons, bought an old sailboat, and we left Belle Isle, and we took several trips. The first one down into the Bahamas and back, and then with a different boat. It was a wooden boat, and most of the things in this presentation are almost all wooden boats. And then I ended up with with another boat that we could go further offshore. And we went to Venezuela and back at one time. And then later, we left Belle Isle, and we crossed the Atlantic to the Azores and on to Spain. And we were gone 3 years and came back across exactly 3 years from the time we left. And that was most of what we did. We did go, I did later on buy a boat in France. It was a 1907 barge. It was riveted iron. It had been around in World War I and II, and I never knew the history of it during those wars, but it had been a Dutch barge and had been used in its early days to haul vegetables on the IJsselmeer, and then had been converted into a pleasure boat in the 60s, and it had been owned by other people, and we bought it from some friends in Texas, and we would go over there in the summer and on the French canals. It was always on the French canals. We went almost all over the French canals, through the locks, thousands of locks, and just an easy life. That was so much easier than sailing that we got spoiled for that. But anyway, I came back here and I got associated with the Maritime Museum through the guys on the Wooden Boat Show. And for a while I was the director of the museum, and we accumulated a lot of the things that are in there now, and began to really study about Georgetown's history in the maritime field. And of course, it's always been served by the 3 or 4 rivers that come into Winyah Bay, and it's always had the same problem with depth of the channel. The mud comes down from these rivers or from the banks of the Winyah Bay, and it has never stopped. And for a while, that prohibited a lot of the development of Georgetown, and it always had the potential to be a port, and it became a better port when Grover Cleveland was the president, and he had friends down here who he would go duck hunting with, and he became interested. And about that time, this man, Mr. Flint, he was a New York developer back in the late 1800s, and he decided that because of the dwindling supply of trees in the Midwest and the East, that the area in the Southeast would be a good place to find lumber. And so he, with some other associates in the lumber industry, decided to build the largest lumber mill in the world. And so Atlantic Coast Lumber Company was started in the idea was started in the late 1800s. They got the help of Grover Cleveland and the government to decide to build the jetties, and the Georgetown jetties going into the Atlantic were constructed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and were completed right around 1900, and that's when Atlantic Coast Lumber Company opened its doors. Had 3 large sawmills, and they would bring the trees in on trains that they built, railroads that they built out into the woods, and cut the trees down and either bring them in by train or bring them in, floating them in log piles of logs that they would bring in with tugboats. And then the idea was how to get them to the places where they were going to be used for the building boom that was going on in the eastern United States. All the houses and buildings that were made out of wood. And so the idea was, well, let's bring in these schooners that will take the ships, these ships would take the lumber out through Winyah Bay into the Atlantic and up the coast of the East Coast to Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, Boston, all the places that they were going to be sold. So the mayor at that time was real interested in the fact that they were going to have these large, these things were 175, 200, over 200 feet long schooners, all built out of wood, and they were going to haul this lumber. And so he thought it would be a good idea to have them photographed. And this was, in early times when it wasn't that easy to get that done. And he had hired, he found photographers who were interested in making these photographs. And so he hired them to do this. In about 1903 to 1910, he photographed dozens of these big ships, and they ended up being in this library. Actually, we found some of them back in the 1970s sitting on a shelf back here. Some of them were blown up to, the quality was okay, but it was obvious they were valuable for showing. And that's when I got the idea of writing a book about that. And it was 10 years ago that I wrote Wooden Ships on Winyah Bay, and History Press out of Charleston published it. It was the first book they published for me, and it was a small format. It was only, see, I had a copy of, yeah, it's still in circulation, but that was it. And it was sold in the late in the 2000s, and it didn't sell that well, but we kept wanting a few more copies, especially at the Maritime Museum, to sell. And one time we called them and they said, well, we want some more copies. And they said, well, we've lost it. They lost the manuscript. It was online, or it was somewhere where they couldn't, it had just disappeared. And they said, well, the best thing we can do for you would be just to give you the rights to the book, and you can, if you want to do it over again, go ahead. Well, that wasn't inexpensive. So the Maritime Museum solicited donors to fund the publication, the printing of the book. Linda Ketron and her company here in Georgetown did all the layout, and the photographs were redone really well, and by Ann Mallory. And so they raised enough money to reprint it, And so it was just a little over a year ago that it was reprinted in a larger format, and I'd say it's much better quality and much more able to be enjoyed as a coffee table book. And I hope you all will tell everybody about it and they can buy it. But one of the problems is it's not advertised like the original book, because History Press had it advertised, and now it's really just being done by the South Carolina Maritime Museum. So it's not as advertised on a reasonable basis. But there are some stories in the book that have been updated since the original book 10 years ago, and the text has been, and one of my favorites is the one that is on the screen now. This is the Henrietta. Now the Henrietta was different from the lumber schooners, and it was earlier. In 1870s, there was a man up in between here and Conway on the river, Henry Buck, who had been working in a sawmill in Maine, where most all the ships were built in those days. All the wooden ships, everything was wooden. And he noticed that some of the ships that came into the shipyard to be renovated or fixed were using planking and materials that were made of southern yellow pine, which was much better than some of the pine that they were getting up in New England to build the frames for the bottoms of the ships. So he moved down to South Carolina thinking, well, maybe he could benefit by this this material. And he bought some land near Conway, and he began to harvest southern yellow pine and longleaf. And then he had small ships that came down from Maine and would pick up this lumber and take it to the mills up in Maine where they used it. This was still in the 1870s. Well, some of the other people in Maine who he was associated with were real excited about it. And they decided, well, why don't we build a large ship in South Carolina made out of their materials? And the only drawback is there's nobody down there who has the skill to do it. So they said, we'll send 100 men from Searsport, Maine, down to South Carolina and live on Buck's property and build a ship. And they did that. They came down in the 1870s, and over a period of less than a year, they constructed the ship complete with everything, and right in the river, right on the banks of the river. I don't have a copy in the book. There's a copy of a drawing that was made by one of the men who was working on the construction of the ship. It was a nice painting, really, of it looked like a huge cathedral on the beach of the river, and they managed to launch it when it was completed, but they had to put the masts lying down on the deck because the overhanging trees, they couldn't put up the mast. So they towed it down with a steam tug, towed it down to Georgetown. This was before the jetties were built. And they towed it out through Winyah Bay, and it was so shallow, even on high tide, that it wouldn't float the boat over the bar to get into the ocean to pull it to Charleston to be rigged. and they had to construct a raft out of turpentine barrels. They made, you know, that was a byproduct, the turpentine that they sent, and they had all these wooden barrels that they stored it in, and they filled these barrels, sunk them, made a raft out of them, and then pumped the water out of the barrels and floated. So it lifted the ship up, and they got it across the bar, towed it to Charleston, and completed the work. And then the men who were on the ship, the captain and all the crew, were from Maine, and they came down to Charleston, made its maiden voyage across the Atlantic. Now this is not a schooner, this is a full-rigged ship, and this thing was over 200 feet long. It was an ocean going. The schooners that were used to haul the lumber later in the early 1900s were really made only for offshore sailing up the coast, and they weren't, most of them weren't fit to sail across the Atlantic. But this ship was, and it left South Carolina, left Charleston for the last time, and never came back to South Carolina. It went all over the world. It has interesting stories about it, stories that had nothing to do with South Carolina, but the fact that it was the largest wooden ship ever built in South Carolina, even today, makes it very interesting. It ended up in 1892, I believe it was, in Japan. It went there to pick up crockery and some other cargo to bring back to America, and it got caught in a typhoon, and it was washed ashore and damaged the bottom so badly that they decided that they would just break it up, and so they sold the ship to a company in Japan. And just before it was broken up, a photographer from Australia who went around taking photographs of ships saw this ship that was just getting ready to be broken up, and he took this photograph only a few weeks before they took the boat apart completely. And they took it so far apart they cut all the wood up and sold it as kindling to the Japanese. And I found this thing online in Melbourne, in a library online, and I just had put in the Henrietta ship, and this came up, and then I checked it out, and that's what it was. So to me, that was one of the most interesting stories about ships that have been having something to do with South Carolina. And there have been a lot of different types of ships, and they're all in the book. You know, even the Sea Cloud, which I was reading this morning about Mar-a-Lago, and the Sea Cloud was owned by Meriwether Post, who was married to Post Serial back in the 1930s. And she not only built Mar-a-Lago, but she also ended up as owner of the Sea Cloud, which is a huge ship, bigger than this one, which for some reason or other, while the divorce was going on to Hutton, she stored the ship up here in Georgetown, across from the Kaminsky house. And it was there for 6 months. And then when it left here with a new crew, Sammy and Dickie Creighton and some of the others were part of the crew. So, you know, that's another story that just another thing that went on that Georgetown was involved in. And there are other, the City of Georgetown schooner, which was on the first slide, was built by, can you go all the way back to the first one? Or is that possible? It didn't matter, but lighthouse. Yeah, that one. That was a painting that was done of the City of Georgetown. But the City of Georgetown schooner was decided to be built by the owners and president of the Atlantic Coast Lumber Company. They said, well, you know, we ought to build our own ship. So they got some investors from both South Carolina and Henry Buck's family and others in Maine. And they built this in Bath, Maine in about 1910 or so. And they built a really beautiful ship, and it was launched in Maine and made its maiden voyage to Georgetown, and it was a big celebration, and it went back and forth between Maine and South Carolina, loaded with lumber, just like all the others, until it got into the storm once, and the people from the lumber company and the others sold it, and so it was no longer in Georgetown, but it continued on until it was in a collision with another much larger ship coming out of Philadelphia. The City of Georgetown was sailing up the coast at night, and it was in the right of way. It wasn't at fault, but this passenger ship, ocean liner, coming out of Philadelphia, didn't see it and ran into it and sunk it. And I did write another book about the captain of this City of Georgetown ship, Captain Slocum. His name was Slocum. He wasn't related to the famous Slocum who went around the world first by himself, but he was the captain, and he was a well-known Georgetown. He wasn't from Georgetown, but he came to Georgetown, and he lived here almost all his life. And he was the captain of another ship, and then when they built the City of Georgetown, they selected him to be the captain. And he was the captain until the ship was sunk. And of course, the crew got off. There weren't any fatalities. And then he didn't have a job, and he got on another ship as captain in Savannah, and they went on their maiden voyage. It wasn't a maiden voyage for the ship, but it was a maiden voyage for him. And he had a bad crew, apparently, and they got caught in a storm, and all hands went down, and they never found him. So that was another story. And then there's the Lina Kaminsky, which was another schooner that was built in Maine, and it was built for owners who were, not Edwin Kaminsky, but the original Kaminsky, Hyman Kaminsky, and several others owned it, had it built, and used it out of Georgetown to haul not only lumber, but other products. And they had a captain who was from down here. He captained other ships, and he and his wife were on the ship. It was during World War I, when they had restricted lights at night because of possible enemy ships. And so they didn't have their running lights on, and they ran together with another schooner, and it damaged the Winyah Kaminsky. And the two ships were together, and his crew of the Winyah Kaminsky jumped off of his ship, went on the other ship, and said, "No, we're not coming back on there because it's going to sink." And so they wouldn't come back on. So he was left there at night with just he and his wife. His wife was on the ship, and the thing was leaking, and they had to man the pumps all night long, and they managed to keep it afloat. And the next day, another ship came and took them off. And so the ship had nobody on it. And so some other ship came by that salvaged it and said, "Okay, the Winyah Kaminsky now belongs to us." And they towed it into port, and we're going to sell it to somebody else. And Hyman Kaminsky had to come back up. He had plenty of money, and buy the ship back from these people, and he did, and it went on to continue being a sailing ship for years after that. But those were some of the stories and the pictures. But the main group of photographs that are in the book are of these schooners that had been delivering freight for years before they started coming down to Georgetown to get lumber. And it really extended the life of some of these ships. And I traced some of the ships that are in the book to see what happened to them. And most of them ended up in one way or another sinking. They would either be in a storm or a fire or a collision or some other reason. They would just the life of a ocean-going or ship of that size was not that long, maybe 15, 20 years at the most. And they turned them out by the thousands in Maine mainly during those times. And then during World War I, the government had several more of these ships built because they needed to transport supplies and men. And so they built about 10 or 12 of large, over 200-foot long ships that they were going to use. And then the war was over, and a lot of them were just completed but never used in war. And so they were sold and made into freight hauling ships. And two of those regularly came into Georgetown. That was after 1930. It was after 1930 that these ships started coming into Georgetown. And at that time, Atlantic Coast Lumber Company had gone out of business. When the Depression came, there was no more demand for the lumber, and they went out of business. But these other two ships, and they're pictured in here, that had been built during World War I, continued to come in here to some of the smaller sawmills that were still producing some lumber. And there were some interesting pictures of those ships and the stories about their crews and what they did. So that's in there. And then I started on some of the fishing, mostly not many of the early fishing ships were sailing ships. They were mainly steamships, or ships that had small engines in them and would go offshore. I didn't concentrate on that, but there were also the steamships that went back and forth from the backside of Front Street where all these stores backed up, and they would load these small steamships and deliver material and supplies to the plantations. You know, the plantations were mainly doing their greatest business before the Civil War, and some of these ships were of that age. But when the Civil War started, that pretty much dried up all of the rice planting, and the city of Georgetown dried up pretty much. Was not abandoned, but I've got one story in there about the ship that was sunk in Winyah Bay during the Civil War. The ship came in from after Charleston was taken by the Union in 1865. The Admiral Dahlgren was he was the main person during that battle in Charleston, and when it was won, the Georgetown had already been taken by the Union, and so he decided to take his flagship to Georgetown just to see, because he'd heard about the fort, Battery White, being such an interesting fort, because it had never been used. It was abandoned before the war was over. But Dahlgren brought his Harvest Moon ship into Winyah Bay and anchored it and went ashore and went all over Belle Isle. And he had comments about how beautiful it was and how difficult it would have been to take that fort if it had been defended. And then the next day he got on the ship to go back to Charleston, and during the night a mine had been placed in Winyah Bay, and he ran onto the mine. It blew a hole in it, and it sunk in 5 minutes in only about 15 feet of water. And of course, now everybody knows, you can see the stack of the Harvest Moon sticking up out of the Winyah Bay off the side on the way out. So, you know, there's so many stories that have to do with Georgetown's history, maritime history, that I've always enjoyed collecting them, and a lot of them are in this book, and particularly the photographs that Mayor Morgan had taken during the early 1900s. And that's the other thing. Georgetown, which had been dead after the Civil War, came alive when the Atlantic Coast Lumber Company was built. And that was the heyday of Georgetown. They had centennials, they had parades, they had circuses on Front Street, they had it was the boom town of Georgetown, and it stayed that way for a few years. And then when Atlantic Coast Lumber Company closed down before 1930, and it died again. So if you want to see the time when Georgetown was at its finest, that's when it was, right around the beginning of the 20th century. I don't know how long it's been, but it's probably been long enough. If anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them. Otherwise, wind it up.
Did Buck build any other ships at Bucksport down here besides Henrietta?
No, he had other ships built, but they were all built in Maine. He had, and there was one called the Henry Buck that was built in Searsport, Maine, and Searsport has an interesting maritime museum, and in Searsport, they had a problem off of Searsport with the depth of the water, and so they didn't build the biggest ships. They built the biggest ships in Bath, and Bath has a wonderful maritime museum, which I visited not long ago, and they all have a lot of the stories about the things that went on in South Carolina, especially the one in Penobscot Museum in Searsport. They have some of the original paintings and the original artwork that was done of the city of the Henrietta and other things that went on there. But we'd love to have some of those originals, but I doubt if we ever get them. But Maine and South Carolina have that connection from maritime history. Anything else? Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Thank you, man. Thank Mac for coming and sharing with us today, and the copies of the book. So I have my copy too. There's copies back there, $35, and if you want to, and I'm sorry, we just have cash or check, and Mac will sign them for you. Really good book. A lot of fascinating pictures as well as stories, the things that are there. I think you'll enjoy those very, very much. If you're going to use a check, just make it out to SCMM, South Carolina Maritime Museum. And they're the ones who provided for us today to be able to do that. And Mac, thank you so much. I love the heart and enthusiasm and energy for the history of the wooden boats here in Winyah Bay. Just to give you a couple of updates on other things, our next lecture, as I said, is always the third Tuesday of the month. And the next one is on January 17th. And Jim Lee, Education and Outreach Coordinator at the Tom Yawkey Nature Center, is going to be here. He has put together a new presentation on the rice culture of Georgetown County. So he always likes doing research projects. And so we're looking forward to having Jim with us. Yes, sir.
I have a belated question.
Belated questions are welcomed.
It's delightful listening to this history, but I don't have in my mind the relationship of any of it to any deepening of the Georgetown Channel. If, when any dredging occurred in that period.
Mac, you want to?
Well, the dredging has been just an ongoing problem, and when the jetties were built, at that time, they had a dredge that stayed here all the time and continued to help keep the channel deep enough. You know, it was trying to get it 15 feet on low tide to get the ships in and out. And once they closed down in 1930, they stopped doing it for a while. And then when the port opened up, South Carolina opened up the port here, and they began to get some freighters in here. Then they began to dredge more, and every year it became more and more expensive for the government to dredge. And so it was, 2006 or something was the last time it was dredged, and then the port was closed down, and because they just don't have the funds to justify it. And the ships that now go into Charleston, where they have deep in the port and it's easier to keep deep, they've begun to concentrate on Charleston. And I don't know what's going to happen in Georgetown if they'll ever. Even a small place like Belle Isle Marina argues back and forth about whether or not it's worth trying to dredge the marina. Personally, I don't think it is. Like the government of South Carolina, they didn't think that it was worth deepening the Winyah Bay. But, and you know, it's caused by a lot of different things. Now, I wouldn't be surprised, I don't know for sure, but all of the clear cutting of wood for the paper mill, you know, the paper mill uses a lot of trees, and when they clear cut a section, and before the new trees are brought in, a lot of the mud goes into the creeks, and the creeks go into the rivers, and the river goes into the bay, and it's just going to be an ongoing problem unless somebody comes up with a
It's an
solution.
obvious problem for the city of Georgetown.
It is. It is.
Because if you get ships in here, you got no way to get material out of here.
That's right. Yeah, it's the thing. I mean, and now that people are trucking and getting other ways of
We've got
getting
no
things
other
in. and out.
choice, no railroads.
No. Georgetown has got a problem there.
And even, and the sand pit is really shallow too, out in front of Front Street, from what I understand, that's very, very shallow.
Yep.
So even those boats that are coming in on the intercoastal waterway are having difficulty getting into, up to the Front Street area, which you see there.
Yep.
So, yeah, challenge. Yep. So January 17th, our next Tuesdays with. Any other belated questions? I like them. January 17th, Jim Lee will be here with us. Also, as we go into the new year, we have an annual event of our Friends of the Georgetown Library annual meeting. That's going to be on Tuesday, February 28th, the end of the month of February. And then once again, as we did this past year, we're going to have a spring community yard sale. And that's always been very successful, a growing thing. It's filling up the parking lot back here, which is a lot of fun with a lot of activities. Spring Community Yard Sale will be on March 18th, and God forbid it rains, but if it rains, it's on March 25th. So we hope you'll join us, and again, wishing you all a happy holiday season and a wonderful new year, and look forward to seeing you in January. God bless. Thank you. Thanks, Mac. The books are back there if you're interested. Oh,